Good morning. I'm Steve Bohm, a partner with Eversheds Sutherland. I'd like to welcome you to the 18th Annual BDC Roundtable. This is, of course, our first ever virtual roundtable, and we're happy that under the circumstances, we're still able to bring the BDC industry together to discuss topics of interest. Thank you to our co-hosts, the Small Business Investor Alliance, or the SBIA, for bringing us the opening session with Senator Toomey as they continue to support the industry on the legislative side of the House. The SBIA continues to expand its reach and build its membership base to support the legislative and regulatory modernization efforts on behalf of the industry. We're grateful for the opportunity to partner with them on the BDC Roundtable again this year. Thanks to Brett, Tawny, and the entire SBIA team. A lot has happened in the world since we last got together, but one thing remains clear. BDCs are strong and resilient. As of this month, there are 99 BDCs with aggregate assets exceeding $120 billion. And for the 50 traded BDCs, their market cap exceeds $35 billion. Our registration list for the event reflects that we have representation from about 70% of the BDC operators, as well as a number of other asset managers exploring the BDC model. Thanks to all of you for making time to join us virtually and for being engaged with the industry. We would also like to welcome all of the independent directors who have joined us this year. You represent a critical element in our universe, and your presence gives an important voice to the BDC shareholder community. Thank you to all of the service providers who have generously sponsored the roundtable this year. Our benefactor sponsors include Alaric Compliance Services, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, Houlihan Lokey, Lincoln International, and RSM. Our underwriter sponsors include Alliance Advisors, BDO, Duff & Phelps, Georgeson, KPMG, Murray Devine, State Street, and VRC. Without their continued support, we would not be able to bring this complimentary program to our over 400 attendees each year. We're immensely grateful for your support and your commitment to our industry. A few agenda highlights. I have a few important items to note about the agenda. Yesterday, we released the 4 pre-conference sessions that focus on topics such as LIBOR, co-investment, critical audit matters, or CAMs, and our BDC's 101 session. All of these sessions are available now in our engagement hub. Also distributed yesterday was the event program book, which provides links to the event engagement hub and the individual sessions. If you have any questions, please contact us at bdc@evershedssutherland.com. Note that the event program book provides information on what sessions are live only and those that will be available later on demand. The live-only sessions included the conversation with Senator Toomey this morning, the 2 SEC sessions tomorrow, and the conversation with the C-Suite session tomorrow. Please be sure to tune in live for these events. You won't want to miss them. We recommend logging in 5 minutes prior to the session start, as you'll need to provide your contact information for each session. For all panels, we encourage you to ask questions whether live or on demand. We will do our best to follow up with you following the event if we aren't able to get to your question during the event. A few housekeeping items. Please be sure to visit our engagement hub. Everything you need can be found there, to include the agenda, videos, webcasts, alerts, articles, and all program materials and presentations. Also included are a number of informative videos and thought leadership pieces provided by our event sponsors, some of the leading service providers to the BDC industry. Our sponsors have provided some valuable information, so please check out their content. Additionally, don't forget to download the BDC Essentials app in your app store. BDC Essentials provide quick access to BDC companies' market information, industry news and highlights, webcasts, and events. The app is the only place where you can find an aggregated current list of traded, non-traded, and private BDCs. The app will keep you up to date on the latest BDC industry news throughout the year. Okay, now I have the pleasure of introducing you all to David Camille, Managing Director of Global Torchlight, a geopolitical research and advisory firm. David advises companies in a broad range of industries on the effects of international events on their business strategies and operations. Prior to co-founding Global Torchlight, David practiced for 10 years as a cross-border M&A lawyer in Chicago and London, acting primarily for Fortune 500 companies and large investment funds. The global pandemic has been a seismic event, but what are some of the longer-term economic and political challenges that may evolve further and may affect the operations and investment decisions of BDCs? I now turn the virtual floor over to David as he discusses what this all means for the middle market. David?
Thank you, Steve. It's the afternoon here in the UK, but in deference to the fact that most, if not all of you are joining from the US, I will say good morning. Either way, I'm delighted to be joining you today to be sharing some thoughts about the state of the world geopolitically and what its implications are for the BDC community and for investment in SMEs generally. And I'm very grateful to Steve and Cynthia and all of the organizers for inviting me to join you today. Each year, the UK Chief of the Defence Staff, the equivalent of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US, gives a lecture on the state of the world from an international security perspective. And in the most recent iteration of that lecture, the current Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir Nick Carter, painted a very striking view of the state of the world, in which he said that we are effectively living in unprecedented times, equivalent to nothing that we have seen since the two world wars. Now, given all that we have gone through personally and professionally over the past few months, this probably does not come as a surprise to many people. But what you may find surprising is that this was an assessment that he gave on the state of the world back in December of last year, at a time when any discussion of a global pandemic was purely theoretical. And we know that a great deal has changed in that time. But I would agree of his assessment of the world, even when it was given at the end of last year. Because the simple fact of the matter was that we're in the closing months of a decade of quite profound change in both domestic and international politics and economics that had really started to impact the risk profiles faced by businesses around the world, regardless of the industries in which they were operating. And one of the arguments I will be making today is that I think in many ways, the trends that we were seeing emerging from a geopolitical perspective had a great influence on the global political response to the pandemic as it emerged this year. And equally, I think we will find that the pandemic amplifies and accentuates those trends going forward. When we talk about the future, the phrase that comes up again and again is the new normal. And I'm guilty of using it myself. I've used it in the title of today's presentation. But I use it a bit reluctantly for the simple fact of the matter is that if you are a student of history, you take the view that in many ways we are always dealing with a new normal. History does not stand still. We are always contesting with events that are changing the frameworks in which we live and work and do business. And so today, what I want to do is go back to those trends that were already creating fundamental challenges for businesses around the world, even prior to the events that we are living through right now. And I want to focus on three trends in particular. First, we know that domestic politics in the US, in the UK, and other countries around the world was already incredibly fractious. And this was having a really dramatic impact on economic and regulatory policies affecting businesses. Because in some ways, the traditional playbook around economic policy was being torn up. And so I want to spend a little bit of time assessing what effect current events have had on that underlying turn to populism in countries around the world, and what the potential policy consequences of that are for BDCs and private equity investors. I then want to look at a not unrelated issue around the debate that had emerged about the merits of unfettered trade and globalization, because that was impacting supply chains around the world. And the pandemic has shone an even brighter spotlight on some of those issues and brought them more into focus. And I think it's worthwhile assessing who the winners and losers are in those circumstances. Finally, I want to give a brief amount of thought to the question of the geopolitical balance of power, because there was increasing evidence over the past decade that events were taking a course that was leading to the conclusion that that geopolitical balance of power was changing. And I think that's an issue that is not just of interest to scholars of international relations, but because of the highly integrated and interdependent nature of the global economy, it has an impact on all kinds of business. And I think it's important to discuss that further and to look at its implications. So turning first to the question of economic shocks and fractious domestic politics. As I say, we know that even prior to the current global health emergency, domestic politics in some of the world's leading economies, not least of which was the United States, had already started to contend with the rise of populist, anti-establishment, unconventional political movements and leaders. We also know that we are now confronting a period of significant economic downturn, arguably one of the most significant downturns in decades, if not centuries, depending upon the scale that it takes. History tells us that in times of great economic upheaval, there is a tendency of populations to turn to more radical alternatives, to rip up the playbook on policy. And I think one of the things that causes me some concern is that even when we were dealing with strong economic conditions in the US and elsewhere, there was already a willingness among voting publics to look to those less conventional alternatives. And so the question is whether or not current events are even amplifying that risk. Before I look at how I think this translates into potential policy risks, I think it's worthwhile actually just taking a step back and saying in certain cases, and when looking at certain issues, the situation may not have been as dire or as complicated as it might have been when we were looking at this situation in the very early stages of these events. I spoke at a number of events in April and May. I talked to a lot of people in the business communities on both sides of the Atlantic. And back then, the topic that came up again and again and again was concern that we were on the cusp of seeing another global financial crisis, that we were about to test the resiliency of financial institutions, of investment funds, and see a repeat of the events of 2008, 2009. It has to be said that we're not out of the woodwork yet. We know that in many cases, a lot of these underlying issues have been deferred because of furloughing mechanisms and other government support mechanisms. But now, as I have the conversations with those same people, the view seems to be that the financial system is showing the resiliency that people were hoping for. The markets are continuing to function, albeit with hiccups, and I think that is a net positive. Related to that, and specific to the BDC community and investment funds, I think is the recognition of the fact that it's organizations such as yours that in some ways are being seen as partners of government to deal with these underlying risks. Whereas a decade ago, the political focus was very much on financial institutions and increasing the regulation of them to deal with the underlying systemic challenges. You now see moves by bodies such as the SEC to try to lift regulations in order to encourage BDC and private equity funds to inject more capital into companies. And I think, again, that is a net positive. Another issue that I think it's worth highlighting is that in some ways we appear to be seeing a much clearer direction of travel in terms of public opinion on how governments respond to these issues. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the ways in which governments are responding are the right ways, and I'm sure different people will have different opinions. But I was very struck by some polling data that I was looking at recently on this issue. Looking at the slide that is appearing now, you'll see polling data that was done by the Pew Research Center in 2009, looking at support for the stimulus package that was introduced in relation to the financial crisis. And you'll see a picture of very divided political opinion. Fast forward to earlier this year, and when the Pew Research Center asked similar questions of people as to whether or not they supported the first COVID-19 bailout package, and the position is starkly different. It's almost uniformly supportive. We know that Congress is now reconvening, that the debate continues over the form of a second stimulus package. And the media reports seem to highlight that there is a great deal of division. But I was struck by data published by Gallup just last week on public opinion about support for a second stimulus package. And again, you will see that that support seems to be applying across party lines with certain variations, albeit nowhere near to the same extent as earlier this year. But again, not to the same level of division as we were seeing a decade ago in response to the financial crisis. So those are some things that I think provide some clarity and some reassurance. The challenge that we face is the fact that we are still dealing with economic conditions that are quite severe. The Gallup organization has been surveying people regularly in the US about whether they fear the imminent loss of their jobs. And data shows about a third of the people surveyed are currently expressing some concerns, which is near historic highs shown during the global financial crisis. So there is clearly an impetus on politicians to continue to respond and deal with these issues. I think the challenge is that we're seeing the traditional divisions between left and right in terms of handling these policy responses erode. To paraphrase Milton Friedman and Richard Nixon, given the fact that all parties in countries around the world seem to be endorsing large injections of government spending, given that deficit hawks in the US and elsewhere seem to be incredibly rare species indeed in the current circumstances, those traditional definitions of left versus right are getting very blurred. And with that seems to be a greater willingness to deal and challenge underlying assumptions about how policy responds to these kinds of issues. And I think that's where politics is interacting in a way that creates potential regulatory challenges for BDCs and the private equity sector and the economy in general that are worth highlighting. Just to name a few, I don't think we have yet seen the end of what I would categorize as the politicization of the various support mechanisms that governments have put in place. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that in the very early stages of the pandemic, there was something of a backlash against large, often listed companies that were gaining Paycheck Protection Program payments and potentially siphoning those funds off from smaller and medium-sized enterprises that perhaps would have not had access to other forms of capital. And I think so long as the government continues to be involved in dealing with the economic response to these ongoing challenges, there is a risk of further politicization, of combined political and media attention on who is receiving government support and what their broader circumstances are. And so any company is going to need to be aware of these potential challenges and headwinds. For investment companies in particular, particularly where you have a presence on corporate boards or where there is some degree of oversight of operational decisions by portfolio companies, I think it's also worthwhile highlighting some potential corporate governance issues that could arise. We know that even prior to the pandemic, certain aspects of the private equity industry were coming under greater political scrutiny because of concerns about things such as over-leveraging of companies. There were congressional hearings into that sort of activity last year. And that hasn't gone away. And it's interesting to see how that type of activity and concern is being tied into the economic and regulatory response to these challenges. So to draw on an example from here in the UK government over the past few months has announced that private equity funds in the mid-market that are seeking to gain supportive loans from government for either themselves or their portfolio companies need to commit, for instance, to paying no dividends for so long as they are in receipt of those government funds, or to ceasing any cash bonuses to senior management, because there is the concern around the use of those funds. Equally, I don't think a week goes by where I don't read an article somewhere in the press about a landlord or a supplier to a major corporation being critical of the fact that they are failing to pay their rent or their bills. And the question then becomes, well, these companies are cash rich. They have access to capital. Why aren't they doing their bit to support the economy? And that is leading to varying degrees of political oversight. And I think that's going to be another headwind that all businesses are going to have to confront as we deal with these issues over the longer term. And there will be questions about whether or not businesses should be drawing on cash reserves or on their ability to obtain more capital through the capital markets or the loan markets, rather than looking to the government for support. A final area I think that is likely to be hotly contested is going to be around the issue of tax policy on business. I said a few minutes ago that deficit hawks are a very rare species indeed these days, but we all know that at some point there is going to be a reckoning, given the colossal amounts of government spending that are being undertaken in economies around the world. There will be calls for perhaps for austerity measures, for cuts in government spending, but there's also very likely to be a demand for changes on the revenue side. What I find particularly striking in relation to this debate is some data that Gallup produced earlier this year, asking Americans whether or not they believe they pay too much in the way of personal income tax. And there is a clear, significant number of people of all political stripes who happen to agree with this point of view. I should note that this most recent data was conducted in April of this year. So after the first effects of the pandemic were felt, after we knew what the economic consequences were going to be. And even then, people still, in significant numbers, think they pay too much in the way of personal income tax. I think the consequence of that is we're going to see a much greater increased focus and debate on the taxes paid by businesses and corporations. We know that higher corporate taxes and changes to loopholes are a significant component of the Biden tax plan. We're seeing that sort of discussion emerge in other countries as well. Very interestingly, there was an article in the Financial Times here in the UK yesterday talking about rumors that the UK government, in a bid to try to boost tax revenues, is going to undertake a radical change of the taxation of carried interest on private equity firms and investment funds here in the UK. So that's going to be another area where I think politics and public opinion and oversight and regulatory environments all come together to deal with these ongoing challenges, fueled by this persistent debate around the merits of existing policy relating to economics and the regulation of business. Turning to the second major trend, the question of trade and globalization. Much as we know that domestic politics in many countries around the world has been fractious, we also know that there has been a very robust debate about whether or not unfettered trade and globalization is a good thing. And the U.S., it has to be said, is the key exemplar of this because of the trade policies undertaken by the Trump administration over the past 4 years. But it has not been the exclusive country engaged in this, and other countries have been wrestling with this issue as well. The pandemic, as I say, has actually shone an even brighter spotlight on this debate in some ways, because we know that in the early stages of the pandemic, we were seeing weaknesses in global supply chains. Countries around the world were struggling to secure supplies of critical goods such as PPE and pharmaceuticals and medical devices, which led to calls around the world for greater self-sufficiency in the production of these goods. Changes in trade also meant that we saw just how dependent we have become on a global supply chain that has realigned to certain parts of the world for manufacturing and even certain regions within certain countries. The WTO estimates, for instance, that in 2020, global trade flows will drop by between 13 and 32%. Just to give that a bit of context, at its absolute worst during the global financial crisis in 2008-2009, trade dropped by 5%. And so that is feeding a discussion about this whole notion of reshoring and bringing production closer to home and all of the associated issues. And this is incredibly relevant because most, if not all, businesses, given the highly international nature of the global economy, will at some point or another have a supply chain that is reliant to some degree on foreign trade. It's interesting that up until now, we were actually seeing that debate settling somewhat. NBC News and the Wall Street Journal have been polling American voters for some years now about their attitudes towards free trade. And what's quite stark is actually since President Trump's election in 2016, the American public were coming around to the notion that free trade was actually a very good thing. Sadly, there is no data that has been produced yet to show whether or not these attitudes have changed as a result of the weaknesses in global supply chains highlighted by the pandemic. And I think that's going to be a very critical issue to look at. But there does seem to be a shift in the global direction of travel. Even political leaders who until now were seen as champions of globalization are now expressing reservations about its effectiveness. So you see on the slides a quote from French President Emmanuel Macron saying that globalization has now reached its limits. And I think what that means is all businesses are now going to be looking at whether or not the debate on the merits of trade and globalization is reanimating as a result of, as I say, the weaknesses that we have seen over the past few months. I don't think that necessarily means that we will see production return exclusively to the United States from overseas. I see, for instance, that just today, the American Chamber of Commerce in China said that the numbers of companies that are looking to reshore production is actually much lower than was originally anticipated. But to some extent, I think businesses will look to shift production back to jurisdictions closer to home that are lower cost, but which benefit from free trade agreements. And we may not still have seen the resolution of this long-term debate on trade and globalization. And it may have new vivacity because of the effects of the pandemic. I'm conscious of time, so I just want to touch on the final issue about the shifting geopolitical balance of power. And I think to some degree it links to this issue of trade and globalization, because we know that one of the most striking features of the past decade has been the underlying shift in the tone of international relations. For 20 or 30 years, since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, since the end of the Cold War, the dominant narrative was very much one that it was in everybody's interests for nations to cooperate rather than to compete. We have seen that give way to much more nationalistic behavior in the past few years. China has translated its economic power into greater military and political assertiveness. Countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others have become much more assertive of their national interests, even if that may cut across relationships with traditional allies. And we know that some interpreted President Trump's election as a sign that the U.S. had reached the extent of its appetite for being the world's security guarantor. Now, I think this is relevant to business and investment companies and private equity and all aspects of the economic side of things, for the simple fact that the key element in this new geostrategic competition and suspicion is the U.S.-China relationship. And you simply cannot decouple that broader strategic context from resolution of underlying trade issues. And we've seen in recent years that the American public has become more skeptical about relations with China generally. The gap between those who mistrust China and who trust China is becoming quite significant, as this data from the Pew Research Center shows. And I think for all that, if there is a change in administration in the coming months, if Joe Biden is elected, we may see a dulling of the rhetoric on trade with respect to traditional allies of the U.S., such as European Union member states, Canada, and elsewhere. We know that there is every indication that, frankly, the ship has already sailed on the China relationship, that you can no longer simply look at China as a trading partner without looking at the broader geostrategic consequences. And that will have real implications for many businesses because of the integral nature of that economic relationship between the U.S. and China. So just to show, again, that this is not just an issue that is confined to the U.S., this is even a discussion that came up with the German health minister a few months ago, where he talked about elements of the medical supply chain being critical to national security and reshoring production. And just to conclude, I think this translates into a couple of actual practical effects for business. One, it's causing global supply chains and all of the assessment of those issues to be completely reevaluated on a regular basis. It's also leading to quite significant changes in cross-border investment activity. We're seeing countries around the world start to put up barriers to inbound investment, or at least to review them for national security implications, and to categorize much wider swathes of their economies as critical to national security. Now, that, of course, creates challenges if you traditionally look to partner with overseas investors because of that dynamic. But I think it may also potentially remove certain foreign investors from the equation in a much greater way than was the case in the past. And that may actually, to be blunt, level the playing field or create more opportunities if cash-rich foreign investors are not necessarily as readily available. And the field of play shrinks somewhat. So I recognize that's been something of a canter. I mean, given all that is going on in the world, I think it's safe to say that we could have spent a lot more time on this issue. But I am delighted to have had this opportunity to share some thoughts. My contact details are available. I'm always happy to continue the discussion if this has raised any issues. And I'm sure if there's any Q&A, we can have those discussions. But again, Steve, thank you very much. And I hope this facilitates further discussions over the next couple of days.
David, thank you. That was a terrific insight into the world outside the BDC space as it impacts the BDC space. So we do have a couple of questions from the audience, if you have some time. The first one is, the upcoming U.S. presidential election will likely be one of great consequence. Viewing the process from your overseas vantage point, what aspects of the election are you watching particularly closely? What would you think are the key policy points affecting business in the event of either a Biden victory or a Trump second term?
I think I would say I'm watching the process as well as the results. I think everybody's waiting with bated breath from overseas in November just to see how things play out and the various scenarios. I think based upon the polling numbers, we know that things are tightening up in some ways. It seems increasingly likely that if there is a Trump re-election victory, it is going to come out of the Electoral College alone, that just the numbers would indicate that there will not be a Trump victory on the popular vote side, and that will add complications. I think everybody is also nervous about this going to the courts, about all of the uncertainty that could potentially exist, because frankly speaking, from the perspective of the rest of the world, we're looking for certainty coming out of the U.S. at times like this. In terms of policy changes, I already mentioned that, there's probably a difference between how a Biden administration treats trade policy vis-a-vis traditional allies. I think we will probably see some concessions made early on to placate the European Union and Canada and Japan on trade policy. But I'm really pessimistic about where things go from the China perspective. I don't think we're going to see a reset button hit. Biden is actually being more sort of aggressive on the China front in some ways. And it's interesting as well that there seems to be a flurry of activity out of the White House in terms of taking new action against China, almost to sort of provoke the Biden administration in having to either accept all of those changes or to walk them back and then potentially be exposed to criticism for being soft on China. So I think, depending on your regional focus, there could be positives or negatives. In terms of what a Trump administration does, well, I think he will then see an election victory, no matter how messy it is, as license to carry on. I mean, there's going to be a question around whether he has the Senate behind him, even if he's reelected, or if the Republicans lose the Senate as well. At that point, anything's open if he's got that second mandate. And I think we could well see trade issues with both allies and with countries like China ratchet up to another level in those circumstances. So I would really, on both sides, watch the trade policy space.
I have another question if you have time, David.
Absolutely.
You spoke about the links between the pandemic and debates on trade and globalization in the context of the medical and healthcare sectors, most specifically. Are there other sectors of the economy you think are particularly vulnerable or resilient to these major global trends? And are the U.S. and other major countries at risk of becoming even more insular and autocratic in their trade policies?
It's interesting that we talk about that because literally overnight here in the UK, we've been told that we're about to see restrictions reimposed. We're going down to maximum gatherings of 6 people again. I know that many provinces in Canada have seen numbers ticking up and have announced similar measures, closing nightclubs, effectively imposing curfews on bars and restaurants. So given the future direction of this, I would say that the travel and hospitality sectors are by no means out of the woodwork yet, which probably comes as no surprise. And anything that is sort of dependent upon life returning to normal from a social perspective is really going to continue to face significant headwinds. I think from the manufacturing side, it's actually getting quite interesting, because for all that there was talk about countries becoming more self-sufficient in the production of certain goods, the reality may not be allowing that to be the case. One of the reasons I've always said why we have offshored production is because it allows us to produce and obtain goods for lower cost. And I think a lot of businesses are realizing that if they bring production back on shore, the costs are going up appreciably, and that is not economically sound, particularly in these times. And that may be one of the reasons, for instance, why, businesses are now saying, actually, maybe we don't want to move as much production back from China as we were originally planning to do because of the cost implications. So I think any business that is hugely dependent on overseas manufacturing is not necessarily in jeopardy yet, once sort of the longer term effects of all of these trade mechanics come into play. And I think, to be blunt, the rubber is now starting to hit the road on trade policy, and that initial reaction, may not be sustained in the long term. The last area I would say that I'm watching closely is on sectors that are quite peripheral to the healthcare sector, and I'm particularly looking at the long-term care sector, which is an area that I know there has been a lot of investment in the U.S. and elsewhere, because we know that that has been an area of particular sensitivity in terms of the response to COVID-19. And to look at the Canadian example, 87% of deaths in Canada were in long-term care facilities, and one of the political parties in Canada has actually called for the nationalization of care facilities. And we know that that's been an issue in the U.S., it's been an issue here in the U.K., and as the healthcare debate sort of reinvigorates, that sector that lies on the periphery of the core of healthcare, I think, is another area that could get buffeted by these various political winds, and that I would watch carefully.
Thank you, David. We appreciate your global perspective on the potential effects of the pandemic on the middle market and BDCs. You've given us all a lot to think about. Thank you to our audience for joining us. We'll see you again at 12:30 for the BDC Ask Me Anything session. Again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Steve.